All right, what do you think makes the 300B so unique?
The lifelikeness of the mid-range and the palatability of the voices and the people and the instruments in the sound field.
They put it in transatlantic repeater boxes buried underneath the ocean. It was designed to last, 10,000 hours at full duty cycle. It's simple but unbreakable.
I think if you're going to ask people that, I think most people are going to say the sound. Absolutely the sound. It isn't, it is because they're super powerful. There is something about the sound that is the epitome of tube sound, that beautiful natural warmth that people crave from tube amps. It's there in the 300B. I really enjoy the 300B. I mean, there are other DHTs, triodes that I like the 45s and the 2A3s, but the 300B allows you to be a little bit more flexible, so you can kind of take that magical sound and you can transfer it to an amplifier that works with a lot of different speakers. So I think that it's useful that way. It's flexible. We just saw the Western Electric integrated amplifier that uses Western Electric 300B amps, and they're getting almost 20 watts per channel out of them. So that starts to be a really practical amp to own instead of something that gives you 8 watts per channel. We're seeing this rise in 300B amplifiers, and I think it's just because they sound so good. I just think you listen to a 300B and you just kind of go, wow, that sounds really nice, and you forget about everything else.
Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is brought to you by ZUAUDIO, waging a revolution in American hi-fi since 2000. ZU's responsive, highly efficient loudspeakers pack massive tone and shove to bring recorded music to life like never before. And ZU cables bring the same. Check out the new Union 6 series, get a first look at the upcoming Definition 6, and take advantage of ZU's 6 model speaker and cable bundles at ZUAUDIO.com. Cable bundle offer ends July 28th. Today's episode is brought to you by Musical Surroundings. For over 30 years, Musical Surroundings has distributed high-performance analog playback equipment to vinyl enthusiasts and music lovers throughout the United States. Based in Oakland, California, Musical Surroundings represents world-class brands like Clear Audio, Hanna, DS Audio, and their own line of Musical Surroundings phono preamplifiers. To learn more about the exceptional turntables, cartridges, and analog accessories they offer, visit musicalsurroundings.com. That's musicalsurroundings.com. Woo! Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I say this at the intro of every episode, but I like to reiterate, very special guest, Gary Dews from Border Patrol. How are you doing today, my friend?
Thanks, Brian. It's nice to see you again.
It's nice to see you too. In case anyone forgot, Gary was a special guest on a previous episode of the show in which we discussed tube amplifiers, and it was a very, very popular show. So we are having him back on the show again to do a deeper dive into the 300B tube, which is, I think, and maybe Gary can help me out with this, I can think a lot of people consider it to be a very much an audiophile tube, a choice for audiophiles, and we'll get into all that, but this is really an ode to the 300B. And just to kind of launch us into it, Gary, I'd like to hear just in your kind of perception, what is a short history of the 300B? And we're not looking for like super accuracy here. We're not doing a big research dive, but just kind of a general overview of why the 300B from a historical standpoint.
So the 300B was designed in the 1930s by Western Electric. Its purpose was to be used in the Westrex Cinema system, which comprised horn speakers and a pair of single-ended amplifiers to drive the horn speakers. Mm-hmm. And the 300B was the tube that was designed for that job. I think it also had some applications in power supply regulators and things like that. But its primary job was to be the power tube in the 91A cinema amplifier.
Yeah, and I think that we talked about this earlier, that's important because not all tubes originally were designed to be used for audio. There are some portable devices over the years that I've come across that have used the tubes from things that were, I'm assuming, were primarily designed for rockets or something portable or airplanes. So not every tube specifically is generated for the use in audio. But Gary, can some tubes, even though they're not designed for audio, be used in audio?
Yeah, absolutely. When the 300B was designed, it's going back to very much the early days of amplification, not just the early days of audio. So small triodes had been around since DeForest invented the triode early on, and triodes were the very first type of amplifiers. The 300B was the latest in the line, and it just happened to be designed for that specific purpose. Western Electric needed a tube to do a job. They preferred to have one that didn't need to run off 1,000 volts of plate and didn't need a crazily complicated output transformer. So they designed a tube that would give useful power, 8 to 9 watts, from a 400 volt or 450 volt rail. And that made it very easy for them to make the amplifier that they needed to make and then sell it as part of their system. Now, yes, there are some tubes that were designed for rockets. There are some tubes that are triodes that are not directly heated. There are lots of different types of tubes. Some tubes are designed with special precautions against microphony. They would definitely be for audio application. To my knowledge, I don't know whether that was ever something that Western Electric took into account. But yeah, it was designed for audio. Not all tubes were, but then, like you said, that doesn't mean that the tubes that weren't can't sometimes be used for audio. I mean, a triode is a triode. If it's linear enough, then you can use it.
So the 300B is a direct heated triode, but not every direct heated triode is a 300B. Can you kind of talk about what a direct heated triode is and how it affects maybe the sonics of the 300B?
So a direct heated triode is a tube in which the cathode and the filament are the same thing. So if you think about a tube such as an EL34 pentode, you have one of the elements in the tube is the cathode, but then you have a heater that is completely not connected to the cathode. It's separate. So that is an indirectly heated tube. There are some indirectly heated triodes, such as the 6080 or the 6336, and again, the cathode and the heater are two completely separate things. They're not connected. But in a direct heated triode, such as a 300B or a 2A3 or an 845 or a 211, the cathode and the filament are the same thing. It's literally the same piece of wire. So if you look at the characteristics and particularly the linearity of those tubes, you find that they're more linear than the tubes such as the 6080 and the 6336. So they would have more of an obvious audio application because of that. They would produce less distortion when used in an amplifier.
How many brands are there of the 300B that are used or have been used? And do you kind of feel there's any sonic difference between any of those?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. Briefly again, the triode enjoyed a relatively brief history in audio after Western Electric and others came up with those tubes. They very quickly gave way to pentodes and tetrodes because people just needed more power, and you can get more power from those types of tubes. You could almost say the 300B and similar triodes went underground for a few decades, and really probably only Japanese audiophiles were really doing amplifiers that used them. But in the early 90s, the Chinese began producing 300Bs, and those 300Bs found their way to the West. And that kind of spawned a whole new wave of 300B single-ended amplifiers and other 300B amplifiers that sort of brings us up to where we are today. So you have Chinese-made 300Bs, you have 300Bs made in Eastern Europe by the likes of Kron, Weish, Emission Labs. You've got 300Bs made in Japan now by Takatsuki. And of course, also in Russia by Electro-Harmonics, and Western Electric, the originators, have just started production again in the United States.
Is the sound consistent across brands in your opinion, or is it something that varies just a tick?
I think the Western Electric is the classic sound because it is the original tube. So everybody has tried to copy that, or almost everybody. There has been a few companies that have tried to reduce increased power 300Bs, or 300Bs with a mesh plate rather than a solid plate, or 300Bs with a carbon plate. But the classic sound is usually a metal plate 300B, and that is the one that goes back to the original Western Electric design. And it's the one that's been the most copied by all of the different companies all over the world.
Now, you mentioned, and we talked about the history a little bit at the open of the show, but what exactly do you feel made the 300B so popular among audiophiles? There's a lot of tubes out there. I feel like I see that classic 300B shape and a lot of amplifiers on the shelf. What in your mind has made it such a central focus to a lot of designs?
I think the thing that most people would say the reason for that is the mid-range and the tonality. There's something about those two things that are absolutely characteristic to the 300B sound. It's the mid-range and it's the tone. Other triodes, let's say a 211, has a great mid-range, but it has a different tonality. It's a different tone palette altogether to the 300B. A 2A3 would be the same. You just have a different tone. So the things that make each of those triodes have their own characteristic sounds are the tone and the mid-range resolution.
When you design an amp that incorporates the 300B, would you say that you design an amp around the tube itself, or do you design an inherent tonality into the thing that complements the tube? So is the tube the sound, or is really like the implementation of the tube a really high point and very mission critical for getting the sounds that you go for?
Well, when you're designing any amplifier, first of all, you have to decide how much power you need it to make. That then determines which tubes you will use. Once you know which tubes you're going to use, then that tells you how much high voltage, how high the high voltage supply needs to be, how much current you need to be. So at that point, you're just thinking about the electronics of the situation. I want to use this tube, it's going to need this type of output transformer, etc. You already know, because you've chosen that tube, that there'll be certain things about the sound of that amplifier that will be already built into that. Obviously, things that you surround the tube with, such as capacitors and resistors, inductors, chokes, transformers and things, also have an effect on the overall sound. But regardless of what you do, it will still be the sound of that tube, because that's pretty much the center of everything.
I'm just thinking in relation to solid-state design, this one element seems to have a very, very high influence on the overall tonality, as opposed to capacitors or other small components that might contribute in some smaller way, right, to even power supplies to the solid-state design. It just seems like this is a flavor, and it is a really high impact, even though, from what I gather from a lot of these interviews, every element does have some type of influence over the sound. And obviously, if there is a choke point or a weakest link in the chain, that's really going to bang things up, and you don't want that, right? We don't want anything to like kind of disturb the overall signal. But regardless of which amplifier we would be talking about, if it was a 300B amplifier, there would be something about it that would be characteristic to the 300B. So regardless of amplifier brand, regardless of output transformer type or the capacitors chosen or the resistor chosen, there would still be something intrinsic to the sound of the amp that would be that of the 300B. Some reviewers and audiophiles comment on how some tubes can sound more tubey or more analog, and some can sound more solid state on a scale of tubular on one side and solid state sounding on the other. Where do you put the 300B on that gradient?
I think that largely depends on how you use the 300B, and I don't think it's really intrinsic to the 300B itself. The classic 300B single-ended amplifier has been made by lots of different companies, and though lots of people really love the 300B, there's just as many people that tell you that it's too warm, it's too lush, the bass is too soft, it doesn't really have any dynamics, etc., etc. I would disagree with all of those things. I would say what those people are describing is the power supply that is in the amplifier that doesn't let the 300B deliver its full dynamic capability, and which means that at low frequencies particularly, you end up with this very soft, mushy sound.
Right.
But if you supply the 300B from a stiff power supply, you do not have those same sonic characteristics. So the other things you put around the 300B are just as critical to the overall sound as the amp as the tube is. And unfortunately, the 300B has found itself in too many amps that are just trying to copy the original 91A and not taking advantage of better power supplies and better output transformers. And so it's also got this other reputation for being soft and mushy.
In that regard, would you say that in terms of a designer's vantage point, is the 300B a versatile tube, or is it more restrictive in a sense than other tubes on the market or that are typically used in audiophile designs?
I think it's very versatile because, like we said earlier, you can get useful power. That would be 8 watts from a single tube, 16 watts from a parallel pair, or a 20 watts from a push-pull pair. Mm-hmm. You can get that without needing to have a 1,000-volt anode supply. You really need 400 to 450. The output transformer is relatively simple compared to, say, the output transformer for a 211 amplifier. So it is very versatile. It can be used in lots of applications, and it's not that demanding of the other parts that you put around it in the way that some of the other tubes are.
You mentioned putting tubes in parallel. What is like the maximum number that you can put in parallel before the amplifier becomes unusable for audiophile practices? Because I think there's probably some people there that would say in a perfect world it'd be awesome to have a 200-watt 300B amplifier to drive their units.
So my experience has always been that if you put too many tubes in parallel, then you may get more power, but you start to lose resolution. And the more tubes you add, the less resolution you have. So that beautiful, defined, resolving mid-range that the 300B has, you would start to lose some of that as you put 3, 4, 5, 6 tubes in parallel. I mean, also, you probably wouldn't be able to stay in the room with that amplifier very long because it'd get so hot it would overwhelm your AC and you'd just have to go do something else.
Wow.
That's just a practical point.
So in that way, it's like it shares characteristics with the classic Class A design of solid state, where there's so much heat generated off of the power exchange that it literally starts to act like a room heater after a certain point. So you can run only an X certain amount in parallel to get total power, but how do they kind of work in terms of the line stage or the pre-amplifier area? I don't think that the 300B silhouette is found on too many pre-amplifiers. Does the 300B belong more on the power end of things, or can it be utilized in that, or why isn't it utilized more in the pre-stage?
My experience when I tried to use the 300B as a line stage was it was just too microphonic. That feedback from the loudspeakers would be picked up by that tube and then fed back to the amplifier, so you'd end up with a feedback loop, which could be very, very alarming at times. The slightest bit of mechanical interaction with the tube, like a flick or vibration through the floor or anything, could set it off. So it was never designed to be a line stage tube, and the microphonics usually prevented it from being like that. Certainly whenever I tried it, it didn't work. It was always designed to be a power tube, and I think that's where it's best utilized.
Right now, the world supply of a lot of things is under a lot of stress just from distribution and obviously the COVID situation and supplies and issues in even, Russia and Ukraine, where a lot of these things are produced. Do you have any insights in terms of the 300B supply from your experience? I know, do you have a giant stockpile yourself, or what are your concerns and view into that whole supply chain for the 300B specifically?
That's a difficult one to say. I think it's going to be interesting to see how things pan out in China. The vast majority of 300Bs that are sold throughout the world are made in China now. There has been disruptions to supplies when Chinese factories had to close because of COVID. Some of them are now opening up, but then some of them are closing again. So there will always be, until the COVID thing is solved, I think there are disruptions. The Russian situation, hard to say what will happen there. Western Electric in the United States are making tubes again, although they're very expensive. I don't imagine that they will find their way into more affordable 300b amplifiers simply because of the price. Some of the Eastern European suppliers, such as Emission Labs, they don't seem to have had any problems continuing to supply tubes, neither have Cron. So, because it's made in several different continents and several countries, hopefully at least some of them will be able to continue. But I would think that for anybody selling 300b amplifiers in volume, the Chinese situation would be the most concerning.
Today's episode is brought to you by WellPleasedAV. Importer Mark Sosa has hand-selected a remarkable collection of high-performance brands like Inuos, QLN, Marison, Qualiton, Gigawatt, and more. Each of these specialist manufacturers are driven by engineering products that communicate the lifeblood of music. Check out everything WellPleasedAV has to offer by visiting www.wellpleasedav.com. That's www.wellpleasedav.com. Today's episode is also sponsored by SCHIITdotCOM. SCHIITdotCOM designs and builds audio components in California and Texas. Based in Valencia and Corpus Christi, their wide line of amps, DACs, and audio accessories fit any budget, starting at $49. For a full rundown of all their products, visit SCHIIT.com or stop by their retail store in Old Newhall, just north of Los Angeles. That's SCHIIT.com.
What is the going price for a set of 300Bs from your experience right now?
You could pick up a pair of PS Vane, Chinese-made 300Bs, for about $250 a pair. Mm-hmm. And they sound great. They really do. At the other end of the spectrum, you could buy a pair from Western Electric. They would be $1,500 a pair. They do sound better than the PS Vane, and they do have a 5-year warranty. It's not cheap, but if you're seriously invested in a very good quality 300B amplifier, it is something that you should seriously consider thinking about. Even more expensive than the Western Electric could be the Takatsuki, which I've seen changing hands for about up to $2,500 a pair. So there's a whole range and there's a whole spectrum. The PS Vane is, in my experience, a very, very good 300B. But, there are better ones, but you just have to pay a lot more money to get them.
Wow. I actually was not... I have seen eBay for $200, $250. Are those prices something that is relatively new, or has it been holding steady for a while at that rate?
I think there's always been Chinese-made 300Bs at around about that price. Similarly, the Electro-Harmonics ones from Russia were similarly priced. That seemed to be the price for what you would consider to be a relatively mass-produced 300B tube. Mm-hmm. Whether that will go up because of manufacturing problems, I would imagine it probably would go up a bit. It seems like everything's going up these days, and until everything settles down again, it will continue to.
Do you feel that there is any type of value to digging up old vintage tubes as opposed to the stuff that's made new now? Or is it all pretty much the same? Does brand determine sound quality, as you've already kind of alluded to? Or is there a vintage collector's kind of mentality to some of the 300B usage in the audiophile realm?
Each of those 300B brands and types that I mentioned has a different sound. You could listen to two 300Bs from the same factory, and if one of them had a metal plate and the other one had a carbon plate, there would be a different sound between those two. Similarly, if one of them had a mesh plate, they're all going to give you a different tonal palette, slightly different resolution, and so if you ask anybody who's incredibly wealthy and seriously into 300B amplifiers, he would still be trying to look for a 1930s made Western Electric. Because that was the original. That was the creme de la creme. That is what everything was all supposed to be about. And he would be looking for that and would be probably prepared to pay a huge amount of money for it. I used to have a friend that had a pair of 300As, which was the precursor to the 300B, which he found in a junk shop in Great Britain and paid something like £20 for.
Oh, what a score.
And the 300A just wasn't made for very long. It didn't have the power capability of the 300B, so it very quickly gave way to it. But he had a pair. He'd found them.
And I'm sorry, but a tube is just one of those things that someone would put up for sale in a garage sale and have no idea its value like that. I hear a similar story sometimes with guitars where someone's doing a garage sale and they're just like, let's get rid of this thing. And then it turns out to be a vintage piece. Now, for every one of those, let me tell you, I always keep an eye out for guitars at garage sales. There is so much junk out there. So it's like, maybe at an estate sale, you might snag something fun up like that. But have you heard?
Well, it is possible. It is possible to find a 1957 Stratocaster that your uncle bought and it's just been stuck in his house ever since.
Right?
And then somebody comes along that has no idea what it is and thinks, let's get rid of this old pile of junk, So, it is possible, but I don't know too many people that found 300As in a British second-hand store.
No, it's a very small, very specific category, right? Have you heard? Have you heard with your own ears? Vintage, original Western Electric 300B?
I heard my friend's 300As. When Western Electric began producing tubes again in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, and I began buying them to use in my 300B amplifiers, I would sometimes take them around to his house and we would compare his old 300As to my new production Westerns. And also we'd do the same with Chinese 300Bs that were coming out or Eastern European-made ones. And if you look on the internet, there's lots of 300B shootouts where people just get tons of different 300B types and listen to them one after the other and talk about the tone and things like that. So, I have made that. I was lucky enough to be able to hear his 300As, and I have made that comparison.
If someone was interested in purchasing some extra 300Bs, do you sell them directly, or do you sell one pair with your amp and then direct people to other 300Bs? How does that work?
Well, either really. Obviously I supply the 300Bs when I sell an amplifier. Hopefully the owner will get 3, 4, maybe 5 years of good usage out of them before they start to sound a little bit tired, at which point he'll contact me and ask me about buying some new tubes. And I can either sell him those tubes or I can just direct him to wherever he needs to go to get what he needs. So it's either really, it just depends.
Well, I guess I'm leading that up to, what do you recommend if someone is looking to purchase 300B? Where would they find one?
Well, I normally write that I have a hierarchy. At the top of that list at the moment would be the new production Western Electrics, or a pair of Living Voice 300Bs, which is a 300B made for Living Voice by Kron in Eastern Europe. Below that, I would then recommend the Emission Labs. I don't think it's got the best sound, but it certainly lasts a very long time. It's very rugged and very reliable, and it does sound good. And then the PS Vane, as I said, is a very, very good sounding, easily affordable 300B that I know lots of my amplifier owners have bought and been very happy with. Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's a hierarchy. Also, the Takatsuki would factor into that equation as well. It's just, so far I've not been able to find a reliable supplier of the Takatsuki, so it's not something I've particularly pushed over the years.
Do you feel that from just your position that the supply is tightening up already or has been tightening up? Are suppliers drying up?
I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, good. That's good.
I buy the PS Vanes from an American distributor. I assume he has a certain amount of stock, and when that stock goes down, I assume he thinks he'd be able to replace it, but that remains to be seen. But it hasn't affected me so far.
Well, when you sell an amplifier, do people buy an extra pair? How often does someone buy more than what initially ships with it?
Not really.
Not
I think
really?
most people buy the tubes that are, they get the ones that are supplied with it. And then, like I said, 3 to 5 years later, they ask me what they should do. I don't know of any that have specifically bought an extra pair or 2 pairs to go in the amplifier.
In terms of the 300B, how much can you speak to the longevity? You said 3 to 5 years. Do you think that 3 to 5 years, from your experience, is something that is shorter or longer than the average tube?
I sold an amplifier to a guy in England in 1998, and he moved to the States before I moved to the States, and then after I moved to the States, he got back in contact with me, and he said, I'd like to send you my amplifier because I'd like you to fix the tubes. The bases have come unstuck from the bottles on my Western Electric 300Bs. And I said to him, are these the original Western Electric 300Bs that I supplied with the amplifier 16 years ago? He said, yes. And I said, it never occurred to you to replace them? No, they still work, he said. I said, okay, well, you can send me the amp and the tubes and I'll see what I can do. And, they duly arrived and I put them on the bench and they measured exactly the same as they did the day that I put them in the amp. I couldn't measure any difference in current. I couldn't measure any difference on the filaments. There's no measurable difference. The amplifier still gave 8 watts, but they sounded completely worn out.
Oh, okay. So they weren't they weren't still perfect.
No, okay. They measured perfect,
okay.
But the sound had lost a lot of body, it lost a lot of warmth. It was now a much thinner, kind of wiry sound rather than the rich, full sound that it originally had. So although they measured perfectly and were still working, they just sounded worn out, basically. And it varies. So, the Westerns can last a ridiculously long time. Other brands, maybe not so much, particularly the Chinese. I found they don't tend to last as long as a Western or a Eastern European-made one. But then they don't cost as much either, so it's not such a big deal if you have to replace them. And it just varies from brand to brand, really.
Interesting. Very interesting. I really love stories. Do you have a crazy story, or what's your favorite story in terms of either listening or designing or anything that has to do with the 300B from your experience?
Do I have any crazy stories?
Do you have any exploding amplifier stories?
I've had a few electric shocks. From accidentally touching the wrong things. I remember when I took an early 300B prototype round to my friend's place to listen on his horn-loaded loudspeakers. And I had it propped up on its side so that I could make adjustments while we were listening, and the thing just fell over and smashed both of the 300Bs.
Oh, God.
Yeah, and I remember that. So that's probably something I don't want to repeat.
No.
But I think, like I said earlier, if you look at the commonly available triodes that have been used in amplifiers these days, you've got the 2A3, the 300B, the 845 and the 211. Each of them has its own particular sound. You tend to find that audiophiles put themselves into one of the camps. They'll say, I'm a 2A3 guy, or I don't really like 300Bs. I like 211s. But there's plenty that will say, I really like the 300B. That's always been the tube for me. There's just something about the mid-range, something about the tone that sounds really natural, very real. Opinions are what make this industry what it is, I think. That there are no hard and fast facts as far as what you should like and what you shouldn't like. But there's plenty of people that like the 300B for those reasons, and I happen to be one of them.
That's great.
Like I would say earlier as well, there are plenty of 300B amps that do have that characteristic soft, mushy, overhung, slow bass characteristic that unfortunately the 300B has tended to be branded with. But that is more of a function about the power supply in that amplifier rather than the tube itself. If you can give the 300B a good stiff power supply, it'll be just as dynamic as any other tube. But your classic 300B amp had a soft power supply, a tube rectifier, small capacitor, pi filter. And so that's how the 300B kind of generated that reputation, because most people were just trying to copy the original Western Electric amp and use new 300Bs in it. So
that is really interesting. Yeah. Wow. Okay, final question on the way out here. Is the 300B your favorite sounding tube?
Yes.
It doesn't have to be. I mean, I'm not trying to pressure you.
Well, you know, I mean, all tubes have an effect. There are input tubes, there are power output tubes, there are rectifier tubes. When it comes to the power output tube, the 300B is my favorite. That's why I've always used it in Border Patrol amps. I've never made any other kind of Border Patrol amp. I never did a 2A3, I never did an 845 or a 211. I was always, once I heard of the 300B and I gave it a proper power supply and a good output transformer, I thought, that's it. That's what I've been looking for. That's what I've been chasing. So that was always it for me.
Nice. Gary, Dews, Border Patrol amplifiers. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been very, very educational and enlightening, man. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, and thanks again, Brian. It's always a pleasure to be able to do these things. And hopefully, if you want to do any more, I'll be available.
All right. As they say, cheers, right? Cheers.
Yep. Cheers, mate. See you later.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes PartTimeAudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and Audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.